Today, however, I'm particularly pleased to introduce somebody I've had the privilege of knowing for some 14 years now through initially global academic conferences on communication, Professor John Sinclair, who has published widely on a number of areas, one of them, the longest in some ways, on the global advertising industry, but also on television policies, imports, exports, and the economics of television global trade in Latin America, and also in South and East Asia. He's also published on diasporas and diasporic media, so quite a wide range of interests. As of now, as you can see behind me, he's the Australian Research Council Professorial Fellow at the Australian Centre at the University of Melbourne, Australia. He's also a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He's much published and he knows a great deal about what he's going to talk about, and now I'm going to be quiet and let him do just that. Thank you, John.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Professor Downing. I'm very gratified to see so many people here this afternoon, including many of you that I've met already, and more that I hope I'll be able to meet in the remaining 2 weeks that I'm here. Now, I have to present from this spot over here so that I've got access to my PowerPoint. What I thought I'd do is I'll go straight to the formal presentation, but I'll make a couple of pauses at crucial stages so we can perhaps have some discussion or clarification, or just otherwise break up the formal presentation. In its structural context, advertising is much more than the images and brand names which form the surface of consumer culture. It's the lifeblood of the media and the motive force behind media industry development. Further, it's the publicly most visible dimension of marketing, that is, the cultural industry which seeks to connect the producers of consumer goods and services with their potential markets, and in fact, to bring those markets into being. This integrated institutional relationship between production, consumption, and the with the advertising agency at its centre, I refer to as the manufacturing marketing media complex. Advertising agencies produce and place advertising for their clients, the consumer goods or service companies who are the actual advertisers, not necessarily manufacturers. However, although the clients pay their agents for these services, agencies also derive income directly or indirectly from the media in the form of a sales commission paid in consideration of the media space and time, such as newspaper pages or television spots, which the agencies purchase on behalf of their clients. It's this intermediary role which makes the advertising industry central to the manufacturing marketing media complex. The period since World War II has seen the internationalisation of the advertising industry proceed in tandem with the emergence of what we used to call the multinational but now global consumer goods corporation, and as well as with the international expansion of new media of communication. First it was television and now the internet, driven fundamentally by their capacity to carry commercial messages to audiences. US advertising agencies in particular had what was then called common account agreements with their clients from their home market. That is, the advertisers would have the same agency act for them in all the foreign markets in which they were becoming active. As well as arriving with such clients, US agencies were able to quickly dominate the advertising industries of the countries they entered because of their experience with the relatively new medium of television, the advertising medium par excellence of the 1960s. By the 1970s, the influx of US advertising agencies had provoked some local resistance, and they became one of the targets of the rhetoric against cultural imperialism in that decade. Subsequent expansion then had to proceed more through joint ventures taken in conjunction with national or other local agencies. Prior to the 1980s, internationalisation was largely driven by US-based national corporations which built up a number of overseas subsidiaries and hence transformed themselves into, as we've referred to them already, multinational, or we also would use the term transnational corporations. However, in the era of globalisation, corporations no longer necessarily have a home in any one particular country, either in terms of their management or their capital investment. Globalisation is marked by an interpenetration of different sources of capital and complexity of corporate structure and management which transcends any single national base. This is particularly well illustrated by the advertising industry, above all in the emergence of what the trade press calls the mega groups, which are groups of advertising agencies. These are organisational and financial structures under which major international advertising agency networks, global corporations in themselves, have been consolidated so they can be coordinated at a higher level of management. Although the very first of these groups to be formed was in the United States, that was the Interpublic Group based on the McCann-Erickson Agency in the 1960s, it was the British agencies Saatchi & Saatchi and WPP which transformed the industry internationally in the 1980s. Advertising agencies had traditionally been owned by their principals and or staff. That's why their names sound a little bit like architecture firms or law firms. But this imposed limits on their growth in the global era. What the British agencies did was to raise capital by making themselves into public companies, which then funded the acquisition of other agencies. Thus, WPP famously bought up two of the biggest and best-known US-based agencies, J. Walter Thompson in 1987 and Ogilvy and Mather in 1988. Around the same time, three big US agencies, BBDO, DDB and Needham Harper Steers, joined with each other to form Omnicom. In the following decade, the French-based agencies Havas and Publicis also formed international groups. Apart from the growth imperative, these epoch-making moves were motivated by the need to manage what they call client conflict in a world in which the advertising industry was serving fewer but bigger clients on a global basis. Such advertisers do not tolerate a conflict of interest in which their advertising agency is also handling an account for one of their competitors. The global group is a solution to this problem. For example, Colgate and Unilever are competing clients, but the WPP group can keep them both, with Young and Rubicam handling Colgate, while Unilever goes through Ogilvy and Mather. Now, this table summarises the global architecture of the advertising industry, listing the groups in their present order of size. The huge Japanese agency Dentsu has been included as well, for although it operates as a single agency, it does have a share in Publicis and it has a long-standing joint venture with Young and Rubicam. The table lists both the major so-called creative as well as the media buying agencies. I've put the media buying agencies in italics. Let me explain. The division of labour between these two key advertising functions has been consolidating in separate businesses over the last decade. That is, respectively, the production of advertising campaigns and the placing of advertising in the media. In addition, these groups characteristically will also include companies in related marketing disciplines, such as public relations and perhaps more specialised kinds of advertising agencies such as direct mail and, of increasing importance, interactive or internet advertising. Perhaps I'll stop at this point as our first break and call for any points of clarification or any comments.
I'd be interested to hear you talk just a little bit. I mean, Rupert Murdoch once said that, not too long ago, said that you have to be, it's an extraordinary situation now because the person you're competing against and trying to do down today may be somebody that, because you're linked with them in some other business mode, you have to be very nice to tomorrow. So that the relation between competition and conflict gets very kind of dense. And what occurs to me, you say how they settle their differences by going to different agencies under one heading. The fact remains, I mean, does that really solve the problem? I mean, or does that still leave certain kind of issues unresolved in this world?
Well, let me say first off, I think that first comment of Murdoch's is actually a good example of what I've alluded to with regard to the complexity of management in the age of globalisation, because it is the case that a competitor in this market will be an ally over there. And as far as client conflict is concerned, the real test is what the advertisers think. Now, I believe that there are some advertisers who aren't entirely happy, but by and large, the sort of Chinese walls that have been established. Well, it's more than Chinese walls, because it's not as if they're all in the one building. That these are separate offices, but they're joined together at. I think of it this way. If you think of the atmosphere at this level, that's where the advertising agency networks operate, and the global groups operate in the stratosphere. Right, so that they're bound together at a higher level of management, so that they can deal with these client conflicts. And I think that if it were unsatisfactory to the advertisers wouldn't put up with it. And of course, the thing that the agencies fear most is losing their clients. They don't want their clients to walk. So I think that it's in their interest to do everything they can to ensure that the kind of confidentiality that the client's demand is maintained. Mm-hmm.
More questions?
John, I understand that forming these global groups gives one is the economies of scale, and in addition to the complexity that you're talking about. But what puzzles me is the comment you made about in the context of globalization, capital doesn't have any home anymore. It is advantageous for them to be able to traverse, boundaryless nations. But BBDO, as a corporation, is incorporated somewhere. It has a home. It needs the state at home to defend its interests, both at home and abroad. So the logic doesn't seem to work for me.
Okay, but on the this league table, you'll see that whilst there are three global groups, you've got so the Omnicom and Interpublic, based in the United States. You've got WPP in the UK. Then you've got the two French and the Japanese. Of course, yes, they're all traceable back to a national base. But there are very complicated sorts of relationships between them, like the Dentsu Young and Rubicam venture, for example. And the other point I would make is that 20 years ago, a list of the biggest world agencies would have had Dentsu in it. It would have had Dentsu, and Dentsu's been near the top, or maybe even at the very top of the list ever since the 1980s. But all of the agencies, rather than agency groups, would have been American. So there has been a sort of internationalisation in that the advertising industry is no longer something that's run from Madison Avenue and out into the world centred on Madison Avenue. So there is this diversity in countries of origin. Okay, well perhaps I'll push on with the next section. Now here I want to talk about what I see to be the research issues in the globalisation of advertising, several of which I've been pursuing. Apart from tracking such global trends in the manufacturing, marketing, media complex, the program of research I'm pursuing examines a number of issues posed for one country, my country, Australia, understood, however, against an historical and internationally comparative context. This context includes the United States, as well as countries where I have prior fieldwork experience and collaboration contacts. As Professor Downing said, I've done work in the Asia Pacific, also Latin America and elsewhere in a Spanish-speaking world. So, in that way, Australia provides not so much a case study as a kind of Archimedean point from which to observe and analyse the different national and regional experiences and manifestations of global trends and the issues they pose. The first issue is the impact of trends in the advertising industry upon media development. There's ever more abundant evidence that newer forms of commercialisation are blurring the traditional line between advertising and the information, entertainment content that it carries, for instance, in lifestyle shows. So there are tendencies towards more what trade magazines call below-the-line expenditure. Now, I'm using this term below the line. It's a little bit misleading because usually when in the trade journals they talk about below the line, they mean sort of non-advertising, like store promotions and direct mail, that kind of thing. And I'm using it here to mean media advertising which is not television commercials or display ads in newspapers or magazines. And I'm thinking of infotainment shows in the form of what's now called branded content, where the advertiser goes to the agency and the agency produces a sort of program and places it with a network or a station or in a magazine. Product placement has become quite notorious and a fairly routine kind of practice in recent years. And normal sort of sponsorship and other forms of non-advertising promotion via the media. Now, even before the advent of the multi-channel environment now offered by pay television, we had entered what I call a post-broadcast era, in which media choices became much more individuated and less social. After cable and direct satellite services, personal digital recorders, or PDRs, have now appeared on the horizon, the latest in the spread of ever more interactive, mobile and individuated modes or platforms for accessing audiovisual information and entertainment. For advertisers, this means ever more precise and personalised targeting of prospective consumers. But even since the advent of the remote control and the video recorder, consumers have had the capacity to zap or fast forward over advertising messages, at least in the form of traditional television spot commercials, hence the advertiser's search for alternative means of delivering their messages. The consequent drift to below the line or even non-advertising forms of promotion is likely to undermine the basic traditional business model on which the relationship between advertisers and the media has rested ever since the advent of commercial broadcasting, namely with the media amassing audiences for sale to advertisers and instead what I'm predicting is that this will propel growth in new means of marketing delivery, particularly the mobile phone, the internet and the interactive TV. I don't have to predict it, it's happening already. Secondly, there are issues surrounding the relationships between advertisers and their agencies. This relates in turn to the degree to which global companies still favour what used to be called common account arrangements, as I've explained, having the same global agency act for them in all the national markets in which they're active. This is now referred to as global alignment, and such a practice has the effect of locking out local or national agencies from ever winning the large lucrative accounts of advertisers who are aligned globally with the global agencies, unless they themselves become affiliated with one of the global mega groups. Whichever way they jump, globalisation is having an impact. Also of interest is the precise pattern and extent of global-local interpenetration with the main agencies in a given country. There's also the question of how globalisation is mediated by world regional factors. To what extent are advertisers and their agencies conducting their media buying and marketing campaigns on a pan-regional rather than a national basis? A third set of issues is more concerned with cultural questions of how advertisers and their agencies are approaching their markets. Research needs to investigate the extent to which global advertisers favour what they call standardised global campaigns or prefer instead so-called globalisation strategies and for which product types and markets. Globalisation is a kind of fairly ugly but useful neologism which means a kind of adaptation of a global product to the local sort of cultural needs and demands of a given market. Also, the global movement of peoples not only has made for more culturally diverse national media and consumer markets, but also for markets across borders based on linguistic or ethnic commonalities. Research needs to focus upon the ways in which advertising has changed as a result of new media of communication becoming available to reach these ever more socially and culturally differentiated and dispersed peoples as markets. And I think that the formation of US Hispanics or Latinos into a market is a very unique case of this. It's a kind of formation of a diasporic market in reverse. Fourth area of investigation centres upon the role of government in regulating the manufacturing marketing media complex and also some of the public policy issues posed by advertising. Of particular importance and timeliness in the Australian case is the impact of the bilateral free trade agreement signed with the United States in 2004. The advertising of certain kinds of goods, as well as specific forms of advertising, notably the foreign content of television commercials, are presently subject to regulation. Will Australia come under pressure to rescind these controls, and what will be the impact on advertising content and the media and advertising industries, including the television commercial production industry? Clearly also the present re-regulation of media ownership just taking off in Australia right now is something that bears close watching. This for the first time is going to permit foreign ownership of the media. At the domestic level of the nation, advertising content as a highly visible part of public culture still attracts occasional criticism from organised groups in the community, especially those that claim to speak on behalf of the interests of women and children. This raises the issue of whether there is a need for more public policy and regulation in advertising rather than less, because the trend has been towards deregulation, towards self-regulation and so on. And if there is that need, of what kind and degree? Most recently, this issue has been raised, not just in Australia, but internationally, with the identification of obesity as a bona fide social and public health problem and the causal role attributable to advertising. Finally, research should examine the role of government as a major advertiser in its own right. The conduct of recent campaigns by Tourism Australia, the Australian Tourism Authority, is an example of how a nation uses advertising to position itself in relation to others in the global era, a global era of competition between nations for tourism. Okay, I'll make another pause at that point because I want to go on to talking about some of the conceptual and theoretical sort of issues. But they're the real world issues. So is there any comment, question on those?
Can you talk about some of the regulations in Australia and what they were? And you say there's a trend toward re-regulation?
Yeah. Perhaps the most important one, which is relevant to the free trade agreement, has been the requirement that television networks must not broadcast more than 20% of foreign advertisements. Now, that in itself was a re-regulation, because up until the early 1990s, the regulation was any given advertisement couldn't have more than 20% foreign content. So there was a relative deregulation of that, so that it is now, the whole run of commercials on the network, measured on, I think it's actually measured on an annual basis. So, there's been considerable sort of liberalisation in that regard. I might mention quite interestingly that in spite of the fears of the television commercial production industry that strongly resisted that re-regulation, it's not as if the foreign ads are pushing at that 20% limit. That of course we now see a lot more foreign ads than we used to, but perhaps as a sort of a testimony to the power of local cultures and the desire of people to hear their own voices and to recognise scenes familiar to them on television. The level, as I say, of foreign advertisements under a fairly re-regulated regime has not broached that 20% limit. Another?
Do you have any comparative? How does Australia stand under a fairly strongly neoliberal government over the last 10 years? How does it stand on a rule like the 20% rule in relation to some of the countries which are the homes, for instance, of the big six?
It's actually a bit of an oddity, I think, that there are relatively few countries that do have a kind of protective regulatory regime with regard to television commercial production. In Australia, arguably, it's been very important, along with other regulatory, local content provisions that we've had over the years in building up the expertise and the critical mass that's been necessary for us to have a film industry, for example. And I'm afraid that when I think of other countries that have got similar sorts of foreign content requirements, I really have to go to a much more extreme example, and that's Malaysia, because Malaysia has a requirement which not just covers the content as to what kind of people can be shown in advertisements and so on, like sort of cultural kind of content, but it also has an MIM, Made in Malaysia rule, so that strictly TV commercials, I think, and radio ads also in Malaysia have to be made in Malaysia. So, but that's the really extreme sort of case. And as I say, local content requirements in advertising production do tend to be exceptional. But for the most part, I think nations have found that they don't need to regulate, because there is this kind of, as I've suggested, sort of a natural cultural barrier against foreign advertisements. And the advertisers and the agencies find that if they import an ad from somewhere else, and it doesn't necessarily work. And there are all sorts of hilarious stories about early attempts to do this. I'm sure everybody's heard the example of when Pepsi tried to translate their global slogan, which was "Come alive with Pepsi." It came out in Mandarin-speaking markets as "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave." So that's a good example of the kind of cultural barrier that I'm talking about. Was there another question? Yeah.
I was thinking of the irony that exists when you look at the role of a government as a regulator and an advertiser. More so, in fact, the advertiser in terms of political advertising, okay? And especially in the United States over the past 5 or 6 years that I've been here, I've noticed that some of the political ads can be really mean and muckraking and tend to be false for the large part of times. the same time, these people also play the role of a regulator when they do get elected. Is there a similar parallel that you see in other countries, especially in Australia?
Yeah. In Australia, the big issue has been the use of public money for campaigns that can be seen as favouring the government in power. Now, this, necessarily is very difficult to avoid. For a government, even with the most scrupulous will in the world, would find it difficult to do this if it's going to make a change in the taxation system or whatever. It needs to make public announcements and so on, and of course it needs to present this change as being a positive kind of a thing. However, most national governments in fact do not have the most scrupulous will in the world, so they are open to quite legitimate criticism, and there's a lot of quite cynical use of public money, and it comes out not just in the uses to which it's put, but also in the timing, so that these kinds of campaigns will come out shortly before an election is to be called, so that the government is sort of riding high in public opinion when the election date is called. So yeah, we certainly have that issue at both federal and state levels. Mm-hmm. Okay, well let me forge ahead. And here I want to talk about what I've called the problematics and prospects, what I think needs to be done in order to develop advertising as a weightier and more substantial field of study. In spite of the sheer public visibility of advertising, its structural significance within the manufacturing, marketing, media complex, its fundamental influence upon media development, and its deep implication in both economic and cultural processes of globalisation, it has become a relatively neglected field of research as such within both the social sciences and cultural studies. In the past, there was a social science literature which tended more towards behavioural effects, while a political economy approach pursued the ownership and control of advertisers and their agencies and analysed their business strategies. However, there was little interest in either the ways in which advertisements addressed their prospective markets, nor the ways in which audiences responded. Within a cultural and media studies perspective, there was a concentration on the cultural codes and ideological meanings of advertisements themselves, taken as texts. But this was also at the expense of understanding audience response and the industrial context. With the advent in social theory of post-structuralism and postmodernism, the diversification of feminism and the eclipse of Marxism, much less attention was paid to advertising after the heyday of such critical work in the 1970s and 1980s. Rather, recent theory and research has largely moved away from the study of advertising as such and more towards consumer culture in general. In the process, there's also a useful fusion being achieved between the traditionally antagonistic camps of political economy and cultural studies. It's worth remembering that in his major work, Das Kapital, Marx sets out to analyse the mystique of the commodity, the way exchange value is bestowed upon goods, and how goods disingenuously conceal the labour and class relations which enable their production. Now, he was still going 3 volumes later when he died in the attempt. Now, that's not going to happen to me, but what I do want to do is to try to renovate some of the basic concepts that we use. The key concepts of our critical vocabulary for analysing the social meaning of goods, concepts like commodification, need to be renovated. Commodification's become an overextended critical metaphor. Never mind that culture would be impossible without investing selected objects with value for exchange. Similarly, the concepts of consumer society and consumerism need to be interrogated as to their implied assumptions and moral notions about how we could or should live without consumer goods. Is it consumerism versus producerism? Is it consumerism versus materialism, or materialism versus spiritualism? The basis of the critique needs to be articulated. Everybody, from Herbert Marcuse in the Frankfurt School to the Pope, rails against consumerism. Do they all mean the same thing? As Mary Douglas points out, the anthropologist, there's a sense in which all societies are consumer societies. And she asks, quite disarmingly, how else should we relate to the Joneses, if not by keeping up with them? We need a concept of consumption which can accept it as an inherently social and valid human activity without abandoning a critical perspective on the forms it may take. In this regard, it's interesting to see a recent anthropological turn, so it's being called, developing in the study of advertising, with anthropologists doing ethnographic fieldwork in advertising agencies or amongst consumers and viewers of ads. This work is providing valuable insights upon the advertising industry as a subculture, on agencies' relations with their clients, and on the design and execution of advertising campaigns, as well as their target audience's responses to them. It's also usefully extending the range of methods available for advertising research, but above all, it contributes that more cosmic perspective, I like to think of it, which characterises anthropology and which is often lacking in both political economy and cultural studies. Still on key concepts, the very notion of advertising is quite a puny, restrictive, unfashionable, even archaic word for what we're now seeking to understand. There needs to be a more inclusive concept for the manifold pervasiveness of commercial messages now being mediated in contemporary societies, a concept which is analytic and heuristic as well as having wide descriptive scope. The industry and the business schools favour integrated marketing communications, but this is clearly tainted too much with its own hype to serve these purposes. Wernick's concept of promotional culture gets closer, but goes far beyond the media to embrace, to take an example close to home, the use of branding by universities and other institutions ostensibly once outside the realm of commerce. So, in the absence of a better idea, we're compelled to continue to use advertising, but really just as a metonym for the whole range of processes of commercialisation of culture carried by the media. Similarly, globalisation is not so much a concept as a buzzword, although it still can be made to mean something when spelled out in specific contexts. In the case of the manufacturing, marketing, media complex, one salient meaning is financial, where it refers to the ever greater interpenetration of national and international capital, as I've referred to. In the consumer industries, hefty foreign investment in iconic Australian brands is a case in point. In the media, there's the extraordinary case of News Corporation that has been alluded to, which owns over 2/3 of the daily press in Australia, but whose chief executive, Rupert Murdoch, famously became an American citizen in 1985, and which shifted its corporate domicile and stock market listing from Australia to the United States late in 2004. This must be globalisation, if the word still means anything at all, the separation or deterritorialisation of capital from its nation of origin. The research tendency towards consumer culture in general, rather than advertising in particular, has encouraged attention not only to the role of hitherto neglected institutions such as the department store and the supermarket, but also to transformations in work, domestic life and cultural identities, insofar as these have become expressed in terms of consumer goods and services. Such an agenda in turn gives rise to studies of how specific groups have been constructed, represented and appealed to by marketing strategies, and of how they've responded, thus gaining some insight into the reflexiveness with which audiences are now seen to regard media choice and consumption styles in the era of globalisation as an expression of social identity. The rapprochement of political economy and cultural studies perspectives that I referred to already finds expression at the theoretical level with Arjun Appadurai's frequently cited concept of a global cultural economy, which is constituted by a series of disjunctive flows of technology, finance, people, ideas, and media contents around the planet. At a lower level of abstraction, but no less ambitious, there's a push among some researchers to assert that culture and economy, this is a quotation from Daniel Miller, culture and economy are not separate or interwoven spheres, but rather economic activity is merely one form of cultural activity. Now, I wouldn't say that in a room full of economists, because clearly this is an attempt to appropriate, the economy from the economists. And in this enterprise, advertising is seen to have a special place, either as the site where culture and economy find their fusion, or where the dualism attributed to them can be repudiated. This is a significant development, given the fundamental antagonism assumed to exist between culture and commerce in both conservative and critical traditions in social thought, whether we're talking about the Leavesites or the Frankfurt School. However, the research being carried out under the rubric of cultural economy tends to be more local than global. That is, locality or nation-specific. And there's little on how advertising, in the context of the whole manufacturing, marketing, media complex, and in internationally comparative perspective, is both constitutive of and constituted by globalisation. Indeed, there really hasn't been a comprehensive, internationally comparative and historically contextualised work on the manufacturing, marketing, media complex since Armand Matelat's book Advertising International, and that was 1991. So, as to my own progress in following the research agenda that I've sketched out, I'm in the second year of a 5-year fellowship granted for that purpose, and so far I've produced papers on the global trends in the advertising industry in Australia, on government's use of advertising in Australia, on the public debate about food advertising to children on television, and on the impact of global advertisers and agencies in the major countries of the Asia Pacific. While in Carbondale, I want to initiate a survey similar to what I've done in the Asian Pacific, looking at selected countries in the Spanish-speaking world, and also to undertake some further work on the formation of the Hispanic or Latino people as an advertising market. So, without pretending to emulate Matelat's achievement, all these lines of research will result ultimately in a book which will provide, I hope, an up-to-date and detailed account of how current trends in advertising are having their effect on the media and related industries in Australia and elsewhere in the world. But beyond offering you such a statement of good intentions, I can't really provide any sort of conclusion to the presentation. It's very much a work in progress. Perhaps all I can do is to offer you an advance invitation to the book launch in 2010 and leave it at that.